In 415 BCE, an Athenian general named Alcibiades stood before the assembly with a plan so audacious it would either make Athens the master of the Mediterranean or destroy it completely. His target, Sicily. His method, not direct conquest but economic strangulation. 24 centuries later, in December 2025, United States Coast Guard vessels intercepted an oil tanker called the Centuries east of Barbados. On board, 1.8 million barrels of Venezuelan crude destined for China. The ship was seized, and just like that, the modern equivalent of Alcibiades' strategy was playing out in real time. What you're watching unfold right now in the Caribbean isn't just about oil tankers or sanctions. It's the culmination of a decade-long chess match where the United States systematically dismantled Chinese and Russian influence in our own backyard. And almost nobody is talking about how we actually won. Today, I want to show you something the mainstream media completely missed: how America quietly conquered the world's largest oil reserves without firing a single shot, and why the ancient strategy of Alcibiades explains everything happening right now. Venezuela sits on over 300 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. That's more than Saudi Arabia, more than Iran, more than any country on Earth. At current global consumption rates, Venezuelan oil alone could power the entire world for over 3 centuries. So here's the question that should keep you up at night. Why isn't Venezuela the richest country in the Western Hemisphere? Why did China pour over $60 billion into this country only to quietly walk away? And why is Russia, despite all its posturing, maintaining only a token presence there? The answer reveals one of the most sophisticated economic warfare campaigns in modern history, one that most Americans have never heard of. I've been researching this story since 2018, and what I've found is that the official narrative about Venezuela being just another failed socialist state misses the bigger picture entirely. This is a story about power, about energy, and about how the country that controls the flow of oil controls the game itself. Let's start with Alcibiades because his story is the key to understanding everything. In 415 BCE, Athens was at the height of its power. The Peloponnesian War with Sparta had reached a stalemate, and Alcibiades saw an opportunity. Sicily, the breadbasket of the ancient world, was supplying grain to Sparta. Cut off that supply and you strangle your enemy without ever meeting them in battle. Alcibiades convinced the Athenian assembly that they didn't need to conquer Sicily directly. They just needed to control its resources and cut off its ability to trade with their enemies. The strategy was brilliant in concept. Create economic dependencies, isolate your rivals from resources, and let financial pressure do what armies cannot. Sound familiar? It should, because this is exactly what the United States has been doing in Venezuela for the past decade. Now, Alcibiades' expedition ultimately failed, but not because the strategy was wrong. It failed because he was recalled to Athens on unrelated charges, and his replacement was too cautious to execute the plan. The lesson? Bold economic strategies require bold execution, and that's exactly what we've seen from certain American administrations. Let's talk about Venezuela's geography, because geography is destiny. Venezuela sits at the northern tip of South America with direct access to the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. Its oil fields, particularly the Orinoco Belt, contain the largest accumulation of petroleum on the planet. But here's the catch. Venezuelan crude is what's called extra heavy oil. It's thick, almost like tar, and requires specialized refining that very few facilities in the world can handle. This isn't the light, sweet crude that flows easily from Saudi wells. This is difficult oil that demands serious infrastructure and expertise. Under Hugo Chavez and later Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela's state oil company, known as PDVSA, became a financial black hole. Billions of dollars disappeared through corruption. Foreign investments evaporated. The infrastructure that should have secured Venezuela's energy dominance fell into complete disrepair. By some estimates, Venezuela was losing the capacity to produce hundreds of thousands of barrels per day simply because they couldn't maintain their own equipment. This created an opening that foreign powers were eager to exploit. China saw this chaos as an opportunity. Starting in the mid-2000s, Beijing began pouring money into Venezuela through what they called oil-backed loans. The deal was simple on paper. China provides cash. Venezuela pays it back in oil shipments. Over the next decade, China would lend Venezuela more than $60 billion. To put that in perspective, that's more than China has invested in most African nations combined. Venezuela was supposed to be the crown jewel of China's Western Hemisphere energy strategy. So what went wrong for China? Everything. And it wasn't an accident. In August 2017, the Trump administration made its first major move. They prohibited Venezuela from accessing United States financial markets. This might sound like a minor technical restriction, but it was devastating. Suddenly, Venezuela couldn't raise capital, couldn't service its debts, and couldn't conduct normal financial transactions with most of the world's banks. But the real knockout punch came in January 2019. The United States sanctioned PDVSA directly. This froze the company's assets within U.S. jurisdiction and prohibited American persons and companies from doing business with Venezuela's oil sector. Remember, Venezuelan crude requires specialized refining. And guess where most of those specialized refineries are located? The Gulf Coast of the United States. One stroke, America cut Venezuela off from its primary market and its primary source of refining capacity. Now here's where it gets really interesting. These sanctions didn't just hurt Venezuela. They created what's called secondary sanctions risk. This means that any foreign bank, any foreign company, any foreign government that continued doing business with Venezuela risked being cut off from the American financial system. And the American financial system is the backbone of global trade. No major international bank wants to risk losing access to dollar transactions. So one by one, Venezuela's international partners started backing away. China found itself in an impossible position. They had $60 billion invested in a country that could no longer reliably produce or ship oil. The sanctions made it increasingly difficult to transport Venezuelan crude through normal channels, and Venezuela kept defaulting on its payments. Unlike in Africa, where China has carefully structured its investments to ensure long-term control even if short-term returns are delayed, Venezuela presented no such opportunity. The economic chaos and collapse of the state apparatus made it nearly impossible for China to enforce its financial agreements. Russia tried to fill the gap, but their commitment was always more symbolic than substantial. Rosneft, Russia's state oil giant, had been handling up to 80% of Venezuela's oil exports to help circumvent sanctions. They had invested billions and provided crucial loans to keep PDVSA afloat. But in March 2020, Rosneft announced something remarkable. They were selling all of their Venezuelan assets, every joint venture, every oil field service operation, everything. The official reason? Pressure from shareholders who didn't want the sanctions exposure. The real reason? Russia had calculated that Venezuela wasn't worth the cost. By 2020, the strategy was working. China had effectively written off most of its Venezuelan investments. Russia had pulled out its major oil company, and Venezuela was more isolated than ever. But here's what most people missed. This wasn't just about punishing Maduro. This was about creating a vacuum that only the United States could fill when the time was right. Fast forward to December 2025, the United States Coast Guard has now seized multiple oil tankers attempting to transport Venezuelan crude to China. The tanker Centuries, carrying nearly 2 million barrels. The tanker skipper, and they're actively pursuing a third vessel called the Bella 1. President Trump has explicitly announced a naval blockade demanding Venezuela return what he calls stolen oil, land, and assets. This is the most aggressive American action against Venezuela in decades, and it's only possible because of the groundwork laid years earlier. The United Nations has condemned these actions. China and Russia have backed Maduro, who called the seizures piracy. But here's the reality that nobody wants to admit. Venezuela has almost nowhere else to turn. China isn't going to risk a confrontation with the United States over Venezuelan oil when they have more reliable suppliers in the Middle East. Russia is consumed by its war in Ukraine and has already demonstrated that Venezuela isn't a priority. Iran can offer some technical assistance, but they're in no position to bankroll an entire country. So what happens next? This is where we move into informed speculation, but the patterns are clear. Scenario 1. Maduro continues to resist and Venezuela's economy collapses further. Without the ability to sell oil on international markets, the regime loses its primary source of revenue. Internal pressure builds until either Maduro negotiates or is replaced by someone who will. Scenario 2, and this is the one that's already showing signs of happening. Maduro quietly pivots toward cooperation with the United States, not publicly, not dramatically, but through back-channel negotiations that give both sides what they need. We're already seeing evidence of this. In early 2025, Rick Grenell, Trump's special envoy, traveled to Caracas for direct talks with Maduro. The result? 6 detained Americans were released, and Venezuela agreed to accept deportation flights of Venezuelan migrants from the United States. Think about what that means. A government that spent years calling America the imperialist enemy is now cooperating on immigration policy. That's not ideology. That's survival. Grenell's approach bypassed conventional diplomatic channels entirely. He used economic incentives and discreet leverage, offering Maduro something tangible while applying pressure behind the scenes. This is intelligence-driven diplomacy where the goal isn't public victory but private results. Scenario 3 is the most interesting. A gradual reintegration of Venezuela into the American economic sphere, not as an ally but as a dependent partner. Chevron, one of the last major American oil companies still operating in Venezuela, has maintained a special waiver allowing limited oil extraction. This isn't charity, it's a foothold. A way to keep American expertise and American interests embedded in Venezuelan oil infrastructure while the broader pressure campaign continues. Here's the strategic calculation. Venezuela has oil but needs refining expertise, investment capital, and markets to sell to. The United States has all three. If Washington wants to permanently cut China out of Venezuelan oil, this is the moment to do it. The country that was supposed to be China's energy foothold in the Western Hemisphere could become America's newest oil partner. Not because of military conquest, but because economic pressure left no other option. Now I want to address something that the source material I've been researching raises, and it's controversial. The role of American aid organizations in potentially undermining these pressure campaigns. During the Biden administration, certain sanctions were lifted, allowing limited oil operations to resume. Critics argue that this provided backdoor relief to the Maduro regime at exactly the moment when maximum pressure might have forced a breakthrough. The debate over whether humanitarian concerns should override strategic pressure is ongoing and genuinely complicated. What's not debatable is the result. China's influence in Venezuela has collapsed, Russia has withdrawn its major investments, and the United States is now in a position to dictate terms that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. This is the Alcibiades strategy in action. You don't need to conquer territory when you can control resources. You don't need to fight battles when you can strangle economies. The ancient Athenian would recognize exactly what's happening in the Caribbean right now. Let me give you some numbers that put this in perspective. Venezuela's oil production has fallen from over 3 million barrels per day in the late 1990s to under 700,000 barrels per day today. That's a collapse of over 75%. Meanwhile, the country still owes China somewhere between $13 and $16 billion that it cannot repay. China is now receiving Venezuelan oil at a 20% discount to market prices, essentially accepting losses just to recover something from their failed investment. Compare this to China's strategy in Africa, where Beijing has built ports, railways, and highways that ensure long-term economic control, even if short-term returns are delayed. In Venezuela, China tried to apply the same playbook but discovered that you can't build infrastructure in a country that's actively collapsing. The Belt and Road Initiative has transformed China's influence in Africa and parts of Asia, but it has not translated effectively to Latin America, where entrenched American influence and political volatility have made long-term control much more difficult. There's also a naval dimension that rarely gets discussed. The United States has leveraged its naval power in the Caribbean to monitor and intercept unauthorized oil shipments. This has made it significantly harder for China to extract its promised oil deliveries, further increasing the risks of remaining engaged. The Caribbean is essentially an American lake. Any country trying to move resources through these waters without American approval faces enormous logistical challenges. China learned this the hard way. The pattern is familiar from history. During the Cold War, the United States routinely engaged in economic disruption strategies to deny the Soviet Union access to key resources. More recently, Washington has employed similar tactics against China's Belt and Road Initiative, exposing corruption, pressuring recipient countries to cancel deals, and making Chinese investments look riskier. Now, I want to be fair here. There are legitimate counterarguments to this analysis. First, Maduro is still in power. Despite years of sanctions, despite economic collapse, despite everything, the regime has survived. Some analysts argue that the pressure campaign has failed precisely because it hasn't produced regime change. Second, the humanitarian cost has been staggering. Millions of Venezuelans have fled the country. Those who remain face shortages of food, medicine, and basic necessities. Critics argue that economic warfare punishes ordinary people while leaving elites largely untouched. This is a genuine moral dilemma. The same pressure that weakens a hostile regime also causes suffering among innocent civilians. There's no clean answer here. Third, China hasn't completely abandoned Venezuela. In May 2024, a private Chinese firm signed new 20-year production sharing deals for oil fields in Lake Maracaibo. China is still receiving over 90% of Venezuela's oil exports. The relationship is diminished but not dead. It's possible that China is simply playing a longer game, waiting for American attention to shift elsewhere before rebuilding its position. Finally, there's the question of whether this strategy is sustainable. Blockades and sanctions require constant enforcement. They create international tensions and provide propaganda opportunities for adversaries. The United Nations condemnation of American action shows that the global community isn't uniformly supportive. If American attention shifts to other priorities, or if a future administration changes course, the gains of the past decade could evaporate quickly. So where does this leave us? Here's my assessment. The United States has executed one of the most successful economic containment strategies in recent history. Without firing a shot, America has effectively neutralized Chinese and Russian influence in a country sitting on the world's largest oil reserves. The vacuum created by this pressure campaign positions the United States to shape Venezuela's future in ways that would have seemed impossible a decade ago. Maduro isn't going to become America's best friend overnight. He's still an opportunist who will hedge his bets until the very last moment. But what he won't do is continue down the same path of isolation, economic decay, and failed alliances. History shows us that when countries face a choice between staying isolated and broke or getting back into the game, pragmatism always wins. Vietnam, once a bitter enemy, is now a major American trading partner. Saudi Arabia, once an isolated monarchy, became a critical energy ally. Even China shook hands with Nixon when it suited their interests. Venezuela is following the same script. The question isn't whether they move closer to the United States. It's how long it takes and whether Washington acts fast enough to shape the terms of that shift. Energy isn't just a resource. It's the currency of power. Control the flow and you control the game. That's what Alcibiades understood 24 centuries ago. And it's what American strategists have been executing in Venezuela for the past decade. The next time you see a headline about Venezuelan oil tankers being seized or sanctions being tightened, remember what you learned today. This isn't random. This isn't chaos. This is strategy. And whether you agree with it or not, understanding how it works makes you better equipped to see the world as it actually is. What do you think? Is this the right approach? Let me know in the comments. And if you found this valuable, subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that actually matter. If you want to understand more about how energy shapes global power, check out the book Digital Dominion by Torre Maras, which covers Venezuela extensively. Link in the description. I'll see you in the next one.